Welcome to Business of Being Black with Tammi Mack. I'm Tammi Mack on Foxsoul, everybody. So, in the wake of George Floyd's death and the Black Lives Matter movement, many companies promised to create diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives, better known as DEI. Got it? And although there has been a rise in the hiring of African Americans, many would argue that these efforts are just a trend. It's a fad, y'all. It's going away like acid wash jeans sooner or later, and that it may be actually doing more harm than good. Well, then, let's get down to business. The business of being Black today is workplace DEI initiatives. Are they advancing the fight or nah? Please welcome global diversity, equity, and inclusion trainer and educator, Kim Crowder is with us today. Hi, Kim. Welcome back. Executive Director of Californians for Equal Rights Foundation, Wen Yuan Wu. Hi, Wen Yuan.
Hi, Tammi. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for being here. CEO of Channing Kelly Ray Consulting, Channing Kelly Ray. Hi, Channing.
Hello. Thank you for having me.
And founder and CEO of the Equity Equation, Sasha Thompson. Hi, Sasha.
Hi, Tammi. Nice to be here.
Sasha, let's start with you. Let's kick things off with you, girl. So why should Black people care? That is the question that I always want to know on Business of Being Black. I think it's important that we know why these topics that I discuss are important to our community. So why should Black people care about diversity, inclusion initiatives? Why?
Thank you for asking that question, Tammi. I think part of it is it's about us, right? For so long, so many of these initiatives have been usurped by other groups. And so what's happening right now is a repositioning of this for Black people in the workplace. The problem is we're not necessarily taking advantage of that. And so I think this is the time and the opportunity for us to do that.
Excellent. Wen Yuan, why should Black people care?
First of all, thank you for having me on. I am not a Black woman. I am a person, I'm first and foremost an American, and then I'm one of Asian descent. So I'm speaking from the perspective of an observer and a policy advocate. I believe that we should work together as different communities coming together to promote understanding, cross-cultural unity, foster community engagement through genuine diversity, inclusion, and equality programs. However, my problem or my concern with the current direction in which a lot of the DEI programs are headed is how the regime is being hijacked or connected with a lot of ideological or political connotations.
Well, we will certainly get into that a little later in the show. I appreciate it. I do think, though, even though you are not obviously a Black person, you can speak to why one should care about diversity because you are a woman and you are, as you said, of Asian descent. So that makes you a minority and a person of color. So you do have some sort of firsthand experience on why we should care about diversity. Do you want to speak to that?
Sure. First of all, I believe that our common destiny as human individuals, as Americans, is greater than our hyphenated identities. So be it African American, Asian American, Arab American, or Caucasian American, I think it's important to find commonalities or just to come to the table and to discuss consequential and sometimes difficult topics such as diversity, equity, and inclusion, such as affirmative action, such as racial justice. So that we can at least agree to disagree and maybe reach some common understanding here.
Kim, why should Black people care about diversity?
This directly impacts us. I imagine if we paused and asked, particularly the Black women on this panel, why did you get into this work? It's likely based on their own experiences in the workplace. I know that certainly is my story. And so a part of this on how I even got it started in the first place is because I experienced it. And I imagine that my story is not the only one because I hear them on a regular basis. And that's why we should care.
Yeah. Shannon, why?
I think that we have to care for this topic because we don't have the choice to not care. Because for hundreds of years in this country and for many more outside of our borders, we've enjoyed commonality as humans on this planet across this what we call the human family for a long time, but all of us don't get to show up at the table. Not all of us are welcomed at the table, and the saying is if they don't give you a seat at the table, bring your own chair. But that was again from a Black woman that understood clearly. But DEI, I think, has positioned itself since George Floyd was murdered by police, has positioned itself so that people feel like because they're engaging in the conversation, that there is forward movement now because of the conversation. I can't help but to think of the fact that Apple was one of those tech companies that made these bold declarations and promises, like you mentioned earlier, Tammy, where people were making all these promises when they were all on the track on the mad dash racing to Wokeville. But now that we are 2 years later, here's an opportunity for corporate America to demonstrate some transparency, some honesty, and to be held accountable. But when Apple was asked to do an audit, a civil rights audit, now they don't feel like this is the best thing to do. But right now, 2 years later means it is time. But without that promise and commitment, DEI as a catchphrase is going to hurt America because they think just because the words come out that there is action assigned to those words.
Great point. Excellent point. I always find it interesting that I do believe that DEI is a fad because one moment Black folk are in and the next moment we're out. It's as if they believe, oh, they're hot on their own trails right now. So we'll work with them until they forget that they're Black and that they forget that we're not giving them any opportunities. And then we'll pull back a little bit and forget all about this diversity initiative. It often happens that way. We're in for about 2 to 5 years. And after that 5th year is up, Oscars are still white, right? So
you're absolutely right. Because, when everything happened, I would tell everybody that is engaged in this work, get into an organization, affect change where you can, demand policy change, get concessions on accountability and transparency and data reporting, build strategies, get a commitment of resources and leadership role within the hierarchical structure. Because what is going to happen? I see it happening already. People are saying, we've been talking about this for 2 years. Aren't we done yet?
Yeah, exactly.
And
When you say people are talking about this for 2 years, are we done yet? Are you referring to the higher ups who make the decisions about diversity?
I'm referring to everybody that is director level and higher that are saying within organizations, I need to focus on the thing that you hired me for. How much longer do I have to look at this red light in the corner off to the side of the screen here?
Well, I think
it's
that's
interesting.
part of what's changing.
Go ahead, Sasha.
No, I was going to say, I think that's part of what's changing, right? Up until this point, a lot of this has been window dressing or checking a box. And so what we've seen now is a level of accountability that we probably didn't have before. And so how do we use this moment to drive systemic change, right? How do we start to unravel some of the inequities that are part of these systems that allow some of these folks to say, when are we done yet? Well, we're not done because it's not tied to your compensation. It's not tied to the KPIs or the other aspects of the business that you are responsible for. Right? They've had an out for so long. And so now what I'm starting to see in my business is how do we make this a systemic change? And I think that's the nuance that we're seeing right now.
I like that question, Sasha. When are we done? It's a very good question. Kim, when are we done? Like, how much longer do these corporations have to worry about Black people and their diversity and their inclusion and your equity? Like, when can I focus on the task at hand that I've been hired to do, which is to create more funds for this corporation versus bringing in more Black people?
Yeah, here's the thing is, for one, it is unfortunate that oftentimes the folks who are most experiencing discrimination in the workplace are then tasked with this. And that pressure is not coming just from inside the workplace. That feels like it's coming from everywhere. Am I not saying it should happen? No. But what I am saying is that when it happens and you see folks particularly speak on the level that we're talking about, around policy, around pay equity, around moving up in the organization, that they are penalized for even uttering those conversations. I certainly was. I can, again, talk to many people who have experienced that, which is the benefit of bringing in an external group who can take a look at it. Even those folks who are hired, and I'm not saying that you should not have them, but even those folks who are chief diversity officers often are working singularly. They do not have a department. They do not have a budget. They do not have the pledged support in the way that you can look at a job description and a job performance review and say, if this doesn't happen, if they do not receive this level of support, here's the accountability connected to that. And so that's what we really want to see, is walk me through exactly what accountability looks like and be able to name for me exactly what diversity, equity, inclusion means for this organization. And don't give me the idea about the feelings. I want to see this in print, and I want to see it moving forward in ways that we can measure.
Yeah, it does seem like the appointance of a CEO of diversity is much like Sasha suggested, window dressing, and they put you there, but not really to do anything, just to say that you're there, right? But let's talk about, when we return, Wenyuan says, listen, this regime has been hijacked. So let's talk about DEI being hijacked and what that means when we return on Business of Being Black with Tammi Mack on Foxsoul. We'll be right back. You don't want to go anywhere. Welcome back to Business of Being Black with Tammi Mack. I'm Tammi Mack, and today the business of being Black is workplace DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion initiatives. Are they advancing the fight, or not really? Please welcome global diversity, equity, and inclusion trainer and educator, Kim Crowder, executive director of Californians for Equal Rights Foundation, Wenyuan Wu, CEO of Channon Kelly Ray Consulting, Channon Kelly Ray, and founder and CEO of the Equity Equation, Sasha Thompson. Wenyuan, please talk about how you believe the DEI initiatives have been hijacked.
Sure. Let me try to introduce a perspective of nuance. So what do we mean when we talk about diversity? Of course, common wisdom suggests that we need more representation, cultural, racial, ethnic diversity in both workplaces and perhaps public education as another example. But what is diversity without diversity of viewpoints? In other words, under a good diversity, equity, and inclusion initiative, should we allow dissenting voices to thrive and to have conversations with, say, the majority voices, agreeing with the utility and the direction of DEI? And I think, in my personal perspective, I think diversity should encompass, most importantly, diversity of viewpoints. We may look different, or we may look alike, but we can think differently, number one. And what are we really affirming with these programs, different inclusion or diversity programs? Are we affirming rigid or crude racial lines, or are we affirming real life disadvantages that often cut across?
Give us an example of that. That's an interesting point. What are we affirming? What are we affirming? What does that mean?
I think that we need to affirm. So when we talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion as an extension of affirmative action programs or policies, we are often talking about representation, but that sometimes veers into the practices of racial proportionality and preferential treatment at the expense of individual equality and constitutional neutrality. And that can be a concern, both in terms of public opinions and both in terms of the law.
Where does the preferential treatment fall in line?
So in California, for example, in 2020, the state legislature passed a law called Assembly Bill 979 that mandates quotas, race-based quotas on corporate boards, I think in the name of diversity and equity. And that law is currently being sued by 3 different nonprofit public law groups, because the law potentially translates into racial quotas, which are banned both by the US Constitution and by the state of California Constitution. And interestingly, in 1996, California became the first state in the entire country that outlaws race-based preferences and race-based discrimination. But since then, since 1996, actually, in the area of public education, for example, the enrollment and graduation rates of underrepresented minority groups have increased exponentially. For example, the enrollment of underrepresented minorities at different UC campuses, University of California campuses, increased from 15% in 1996 to 26% in 2019. So that also leads me to my next question.
My question, when you do a disaggregate of that data, who are those populations where you've seen the increase?
Hispanic students, African American students, and Native American students. So these are the underrepresented minorities.
And when you compare those rates of increase against the rates of people who are of Asian descent, is there a gap? Does one group or several groups enjoy representation more than the others?
Yes, there is a gap in terms of enrollment, especially at the most prestigious campuses like UCLA and UC Berkeley. However, there is an absolute increase across the board. And when we
Are you suggesting that increase is the preferential treatment?
No, I'm saying that in a state without preferential treatment, or in a state that has outlawed preferential treatment, we have achieved tremendous progress in terms of diversity and representation. It can be done. My caution is against doing it illegally or doing it at the expense of individual equality.
Well, and we have to say that California voted down affirmative action, so there is no affirmative action in the state of California.
Well, can I also add something in and say that affirmative action, one, benefits white women the most, period. Yes. Like, let's just start there when we talk about it. But also, I think it's important to say that even if we see representation that still does not connect to experiential treatment, what have been the experiences of those folks if we are talking about that at a level of saying, okay, great, there was an increase of folks, but are their experiences in those places still positive? Are they still having the same negative experiences? And even if enrollment has increased, and I cannot answer this, and you may be able to shed some light on this, what is the graduation rate? So what's the through line around that? What does that look like around employment and rate of employment, but also not only rate of employment, what does that look like around what they're being paid? And we know that the racial wealth gap still exists, particularly for women, and especially as you add in LGBTQI+, all of this is part of the conversation. So in my mind, I feel like the beginnings of this is sort of having this conversation in a vacuum, when in fact there's a larger through line that we should be thinking about when we are starting to talk about it in this way.
And it brings me to another point. Go ahead, Shannon.
Let me also add that Washington State, through Initiative 200, enacted the same sort of legislation where they banned affirmative action. But the results seen in Washington State have been deplorable, where the enrollment of people of color, and especially BIPOC folks, Black, Indigenous people of color, has plummeted, to the point that Washington State is revisiting that conversation. And that'll be put before the voters again, because the whole point of affirmative action is to cast a wide net. The whole point of affirmative action is to find those places where disparities exist and to eliminate those roadblocks and obstacles. And I'm the first one to say that having DEI as a tagline is dangerous, because people walk away from the conversation thinking, oh, this is a Black people issue.
Right.
That's right.
People get threatened by this idea of a Black people issue. But, diversity, equity, and inclusion, if we remove the tagline and talk about workplace rights, worker rights, fair rights, we talk about social justice and social equity and those pillars across communities where the left hand doesn't know what the right hand's doing. I think that having that tagline is the thing that is the disservice of the Black community, because people have been real good at isolating Black folks, and giving it a tagline means that you can put it under the umbrella of this and say, well, why do we have to lower standards? Why do
That's right.
Yeah, that has always been my concern. Thank you for bringing that up, Channing. That has always been my concern, is that when we talk about diversity, inclusion, equity, more than anything, when we talk about affirmative action, when we talk about these things, it always pops up that, well, why should I hire somebody who's less qualified? That does not mean that they are less qualified. It means that you've overlooked the more qualified in most cases for people who are of white descent.
And it also means that you have created the baseline that does not represent the folks who are not white, that you are writing job descriptions, that you are creating space in your organizations for those folks, for men, for people who do not have disability, for folks who are not LGBTQI plus. You have created that in a way so that when people do show up, that then they're put upon as quote unquote not unqualified, when in fact we know that anyone on this panel who is a person of color can tell you that they have outworked and outstudied and out-researched and out-understood many people within their organizations and their counterparts, and have been paid less and discounted on a regular basis.
I mean, look at what's happening at the Supreme Court right now, right? No one has
Perfect
ever
example
asked for anyone.
Let's go to break. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Business of Being Black with Tammi Mack, where the business of being Black today is DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion. And we were just talking about the Supreme Court and what's happening to the first Black woman to ever be nominated, what's happening to her nomination at this very point. Let's finish that thought.
Yeah, I mean, what I was saying was, at no other time have we ever mentioned somebody else's LSAT scores, right? But of course, it's coming up right now. And I used to work in testing, and so I understand that those there's bias in those test scores. Yes. Great, fine. But if we're going to ask for one, then let's look at all of them, right? Let's talk about what this looks like across the board. And if she has to jump through those hoops, then everybody else needs to jump through those same hoops. And I guarantee, going back to what Kim said, that she is going to outshine many of the folks that are there, because we never question mediocre people. We never question that.
Well, we never question mediocre people if they are white.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
But if they are Black, even if you are your best, even if you are top of the class, there is questions that surround how you got that smart, how you got that creative, how you even got there in the first place. No?
And I think that part of the problem is, this is why I have an issue with kind of what's happening in California and what's happening around affirmative action, right? We're doing this based on compliance. We're doing this based on numbers. So I don't agree with quotas at all, right? We don't want to do the numbers, but let's look at what is fair and equitable and bringing people in and open it up so that everyone has an opportunity to showcase, okay, this is the best and the brightest. You're not creating barriers to entry just because of race, gender, sexual orientation, because those are built into the system. And so many of these programs are, what are the inequities that are built into these systems, and how do we dismantle those so that everyone has an opportunity to shine? And so
how do you feel about that point that Sasha just made? She doesn't believe in the quotas. She believes in allowing the best and the brightest to have the job.
I completely agree with that. And circling back to affirmative action in California, let me just clarify that affirmative action is not categorically banned in California and 9 other states in the United States. Needs-based affirmative action programs that give reasonable assistance to underprivileged students and individuals is perfectly legal. What was banned in California, and it was reaffirmed in 2020 when the campaign that I served as the executive director, won a landslide victory on the ballot in 2020 was a ban on racial preferences and discrimination in public education, public contracting, and public employment. So coming back to the topic of how we can lift up everyone, and we're not talking about representation or diversity or these important social initiatives from a zero-sum perspective. We want to create win-win situations in which we can select, train, and identify talents regardless of race, regardless of skin color, regardless of national origin. As you can tell, I have an accent. I'm an American by choice. I was not born here, but I believe that the system that we are fighting for, which is a system of equal opportunity and equal access, can't afford individuals with the most amount of access and opportunity compared with other systems in the rest of the world.
Is affirmative action and DEI one and the same, or are they completely different?
They are strange bedfellows, Tammy. But let me tell you, when it comes to this idea of racial preference, and again, this is my problem with DEI. It narrows the band of people's thinking. Now, if you put in front of the ballot to me whether or not we should outlaw racial preferences, you know what I'm going to say? I'm going to say we should absolutely outlaw it. But my concern is not that people of color will be getting racial preferences. My problem is the hundreds of years of racial preferences that are born to white folks that enjoy that benefit that nobody challenges. Mm-hmm. Everybody wants to challenge nobody cared about challenging racial preferences until we tried to level a playing field. Mm-hmm. So we're going to talk about challenging racial preferences and this beloved system that we're trying to fight for. People ask me all the time, Shannon, how do we fix the system? The system isn't working for kids with disabilities in public schools. And how do we fix the system for women who don't enjoy opportunity? How do we fix the system for folks who are LGBTQI plus or differently able or neurodiverse? The system is functioning in the exact way that it was built and designed to function. Yeah. And that is the problem.
So has this worked? Has DEI worked? Have these initiatives worked? Has there been, according to President Joe Biden, there has been an uptick in employment? Have companies hired more people of color?
Oh, so there's a lot of people at the party. Yeah. But that doesn't mean that everybody can party, just eat, drink, or dance.
That's right.
That's the challenge. And so I think that, again, when people talk about this issue, they don't discuss the nuance of the issue. Mm-hmm. And one of the reasons that my company gets brought to organizations oftentimes is either they don't have a structural framework to engage and talk about DEI in a way that's real, meaningful, and honest. Because I talk about objectives and key results or SMART goals and data and having data-driven decision-making and holding yourselves accountable on the front end and on the back end. But then also because they have hired DEI leaders that don't even have the benefit of the assumption of good intentions, that don't have the authority or power within the organization to affect any change. And the average tenure of those leaders is anywhere from 1 to 3 years because they get tired of getting stabbed in the back or dragged across the floors and getting kicked in the shin, that they just leave.
Kim, let me hop in. Is it working, Kim?
Yeah, what I think is so important around what Shannon said. Shannon just laid out her organization's approach to this. And so a lot of times when we're talking about diversity, equity, inclusion, it is an unregulated industry. It is an industry in which everyone has different approaches about how they go about doing this work, but it is also an industry that is laid at the mercy for whether or not organizations are willing to make decisions to move this forward. And so when we ask the question of, is it working? It's such a flat question in comparison to the nuances of what this looks like in the workplace. What are our deciding factors around whether or not it is successful or not? One of the things that Shannon called out is that particularly when you're putting folks in these spaces of DEI within organizations, they have a short lifespan in that organization. You know why? Because it's hard. And so what we're not talking about is those nuances around what is success even in this. Are we seeing the racial wealth gap decrease? Are we seeing more folks in the C-suite, not only who are just sitting there, because I haven't been in a C-suite where I was expected to keep my mouth shut. I'm talking about shifts in power. And so that is why we need to have these conversations. I love this. We need continuous think tanks for everyone who is sitting here. Is so important to the conversation around this dialogue. And we need to do it regularly, because what we have to do is walk into organizations and make them sort of, hold a fire to, here's what we have all decided the goals are. Then let's create that so that we can move this forward.
How do we measure success when it comes to diversity, equity, and inclusion?
That's a great question. I was just going to say that when we talk about whether or not it has worked, we need to examine how we measure success and at what expense. So to give you a concrete example, UC Berkeley last year, a survey found out that UC Berkeley spends about $250 million a year to advance racial equity and inclusion programs and hire personnel to take charge of these programs. By itself, DEI is a multi-billion-dollar and growing industry. But at the same time, everybody loses if we are on a sinking ship. I say this because California, for example, 6 out of 10 California students grades 3 through 8 cannot do math proficiently. 5 out of 10 cannot read at a grade level. So are we just fixing the finishing line, sort of in college admissions and in workplaces, in the corporate world?
We're going to touch on that when we return. We got to take a quick break on Business of Being Black with Tammi Mack. Welcome back to Business of Being Black with Tammi Mack. And the business of being Black today is DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives in companies. Are they benefiting this diversity fight that America is up against right now? Wenyuan was talking about, when we left, how we can measure the success of these initiatives in companies. And you suggested, Wenyuan, that UC Berkeley puts millions, almost $215 million into diversity programs. And are they working? Yes or no?
I don't think so.
And then you mentioned that when we look at the 6th grade education, 8th grade education, there has been a narrowed scope of reading capabilities for those particular students. But certainly we aren't suggesting that Berkeley is admitting students who can't read.
Oh, I am not suggesting that. I'm suggesting that the issues go much deeper than the finishing line of college admissions or workplace hiring and promotion. It goes deeper into the pipeline of K-12. And I think the end goal is, both in the American corporate workplaces and in our education system, is to train and prepare a workforce that is globally competitive. And when we focus so much of our attention on these social initiatives that have not been empirically tested and validated through social sciences, we can sometimes run the risk of missing the whole picture, of lifting up the whole system, lifting up the whole boat.
I think there's some truth in what you're saying there. Kim, I see you kind of nodding in agreement here. There's some truth in what Wenyuan is saying. Are we missing the whole scope of equity and inclusion when we only focus on race?
I think what Wenyuan has said is, I agree with a piece of it, but also it's tricky as a whole to look at. And the reason why I say that, particularly if we're looking at K through 12 and what happens in school systems, we are currently at baseline talking about the lack of history being taught around Black history that is inclusive, around understanding world history from more than a United States perspective. And so we are talking about what youth, how they're being educated, but also when we look at standardized testing in and of itself is full of bias, particularly bias that supports white folks, like, period. There's not a pretty way to say that. but also the way that people learn, the way that people retain information, the way that people are able to interpret that information. So all of this is part of the conversation. I think, again, when we flatten it, we lose out on the nuances. We even in part of that conversation, we're talking about resources and what is available to some schools versus the other. But at the end of the day, we are still talking about a white supremacist measurement of intelligence. That is what we're talking about.
What Wenyuan is talking about is quite universal. She's referring to math. She's referring to reading. And for those of you who are familiar with the great John Singleton, who created the awesome Oscar-winning movie Boys in the Hood, Furious Styles suggested to Trey in that movie that math is where your diamonds are, because math is universal. You can never disagree with math. There's nothing subjective about it. So
but you can
that Wenyuan is talking about, they're not subjective.
You can talk about the way that it is learned and the way that it is presented, and who has access to that.
Even if you get outside of that, let me push back and say this. Number one, I think that the people who have the biggest problem with changing the foundation of today's system are the ones who learn how to game the system and use it to their advantage. That's number one. Number two, I think that when you talk about test scores, math scores, is there some validity in white supremacist culture and these things in those cases? Yeah, there's some of that. But when you talk about the test scores of kids in schools, I think that you are not looking at the issue holistically in the way that does it justice when you don't think about the fact that you have to look at, okay, so what are all of those systems that will impact whether or not a kid is successful?
Yes.
Right. Does that kid have everything that they need in terms of home and housing? Do they have a district that is resourced? Do they have a school full of substitute teachers where none of them are uniquely qualified to teach kids? You have to look at all of those different social and institutional structures that impact that.
And the historical basis behind that, right?
Exactly. And then to the point of whether or not DEI works. Wenyuan talked about the fact that, she is an American by choice, that she has come to this country. And I'll tell you, if we take the tagline of DEI out of the equation and we look at what the end goal of the principles of DEI mean, if that wasn't successful, Wenyuan, you would not exist as you do currently in this country.
Do you believe that, Wenyuan?
I respectfully disagree.
Please share.
Because it wasn't long ago that people of Asian descent weren't even permitted to naturalize in this country. And then that was a DEI argument. It wasn't always that women could be educated in California schools and have the advanced degrees that you enjoy. That's a DEI issue. To be a homeowner, that's a DEI issue. People of Asian descent in California couldn't own businesses, couldn't own land, couldn't naturalize, couldn't vote, and didn't enjoy the rights and privileges of citizenship. And people fighting under this umbrella of what is today called DEI made that possible for me and for people like you. So it works. But
and it is important.
Wenyuan respectfully disagrees. I'd like to hear.
I fundamentally think that acting and thinking in terms of race, in terms of this fad of DEI is divisive and counterproductive. I approach civil rights as a radically and fundamentally liberal concept. Civil rights are first and foremost individual rights. They are individual rights of equal access and equal rights. So when we look at the gains of women and minority in the United States, a melting pot in the recent 4, 5, 6 decades in terms of accessing fair housing, equal education opportunities, and much more. I'm approaching this as an issue of civil rights or advancements in terms of civil rights, not necessarily framed in or wrapped in this rhetoric of DEI. So this is where my point of departure comes into play. And I think Shannon mentioned something about resources. A Stanford study recently found out that even among California students who are economically disadvantaged, there are still persistent achievement gaps. So how do we, and the biggest gap is not between white and Black students. The biggest gap is between Asian students whose parents mostly are first-generation immigrants, and indigenous students. So how do we analyze these nuances, these different numbers? How do we approach this? Do we interpret this as a byproduct of white supremacist structure that we need to condemn? Or do we approach this as something that's more complicated, that require policy analysis and long-term, sometimes painful policy solutions?
Painful policy solutions, Sasha?
There's just so much to unwrap in everything that's been said. And I've been trying to process it all because I think there's several different pieces to this. I think one, we need to get out of California, right? Because that's not the US and that's not the reality of what's happening across the country. Yep. California is just one piece of the puzzle, right? So I understand that that's kind of your point of view, but that is not necessarily what is happening across the rest of this country. And I think it was interesting dialogue because there was this preface of being selecting to be a US citizen. I became a US citizen in 2016. I was raised in Virginia, but my citizenship was elsewhere. I have dual citizenship. And so I've understood both worlds, but I've understood that I've shown up as a Black person in this country and I've had to deal with racism that had nothing to do with where I was born, right? I had to deal with the environments in which I was raised and the environments in which I worked, right? And so I've had to overcome a lot of those barriers of my Blackness because of, and so I know we have to go to break, but I just want to make sure.
We'll be right back.
Touch that. Yep.
Welcome back to Business of Being Black with Tammi Mack, where today the business of being Black is workplace DEI initiatives. Please welcome global diversity, equity, and inclusion trainer and educator Kim Crowder is here with us today. Also, Wenyuan Wu is with us today. Channon Kelly Ray is with us today, and Sasha Thompson. Please complete that thought before break.
Yeah, so I think me being an immigrant to this country and living within two worlds within my household has shaped my lens and how I see DEI, right? And so as we've been having this conversation, the one thing that has become very clear to me, two things really. One is how are we even defining DEI, right? So many people lump it together as one thing, and each thing is its very own different element. And so we've been talking about numbers, we've been talking about quotas, we've been talking about what I call butts in seats. That's diversity, right? It's the equity and inclusion part that I think we're starting to see a shift toward. Right? What does inclusion look like? What does that mean within an organization? And so those are the things that I think we still need to start working on. And that goes beyond the quotas, right? And then equity. What are the things that we need to do to either remove barriers or provide support? And I think that's probably where we start to butt heads because everyone's talking about equity. It's the same thing as equality. And it's not the same thing. Not everybody needs the same thing.
And whether or not someone belongs.
Exactly. Right. And so that's when we go back to the question, Tammi, you had around how do we define success? So what do we look like for success? What does success look like? Those are the pieces that we need to look at. And it's not necessarily a number, right? Because we're all about the data, but it's not necessarily a number, how someone is showing up in the workplace. And if they feel valued, seen, and heard, and or if they're not, that's information that these programs are supposed to tap into. That's
Speaking of programs, Sasha, tell us about the equity equation.
Okay. So the equity equation actually is a coaching and consulting business. And what we do is exactly this. We work with organizations. We talk to them about what does this look like for their organization, because we can't say what happens at one organization happens at another. And so we find what is unique and special about your organization. What are the things that make you tick, and where are the gaps that you all need to fill? The other part of my business is coaching. And so primarily I coach DEI practitioners because this work is hard. And so as Kim talked about at the top, very few of them work with other people. And so I try to build that community, or at least provide them some resources and guidance so that they do not feel as if they were alone in this work. And so that's what we do.
When you on, Sasha is talking about DEI and what her company does. But I want to jump back a little bit to what Channing said to you in terms of you benefiting from DEI in California alone, and you respectfully disagreeing with that. What is the disagreement? You don't believe that those initiatives and civil rights initiatives and DEI initiatives have put you where you are today? Or do you just believe that DEI and civil rights are two separate entities?
I believe these are two completely separate concepts. I believe that civil rights and equal rights are the cornerstone of the American dream, of the American liberal experiment. And I believe that where I am today, which is very, very far away from where I came from, is a direct result of my own initiative, my own agency, in combination with the blessings of the promise of civil rights and what we have achieved through the civil rights movement. An interesting historical anecdote, which often reminds me of the power of empowerment and positive thinking. During the 25 years after the passage of the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882, over 10,000 case lawsuits were brought to different federal and state courts against the Chinese Exclusion Act by primarily Chinese American lawyers. So they were working under the promise and principle of the 14th Amendment.
So I want you to tell us about Californians for Equal Rights Foundation that you work with.
Sure. Thank you for this opportunity. We are a non-partisan and nonprofit organization dedicated to raising public awareness and advancing the fundamental principle of equality, which is the letter and spirit of the 14th Amendment to the US Constitution, as well as the California state constitutional principle of equal treatment. And we work in legal advocacy, voter education, media outreach, and policy monitoring on issues related to the advancement of equal rights.
Kim, I thank you for always coming through on Business of Being Black, sis. Please tell us about Crowder Consulting.
Kim Crowder Consulting, we help organizations embed diversity, equity, inclusion into their daily workplace practices. Also, when we look at a qualitative and quantitative approach to this, and we include history and organizational change and structure. I'm Six Sigma Leadership certified. I have an amazing team. And really what that means is helping organizations get out of their own way in creating workplaces that are equitable and understanding the nuances of what their team members are experiencing that may be beyond their scope of understanding.
Right. Shannon, what services are available for your clients? You've told us a little bit about it, but we got to hear about Kelly Ray Consulting.
So thank you so much. Shannon Kelly Ray Consulting is made up of a global team of subject matter experts, where we come into an organization to use both qualitative and quantitative data to help organizations set strategic frameworks so that they can build actionable, tangible strategies with performance measures assigned to those strategies so that they know how they're winning and what that looks like and the inflection point they assess. But I think it's also important to note that, you know, the work that my firm does really does align with some of what When You Win is saying. And that is, you know, when you think about whether or not you benefited from what we've taglined DEI, but really it is civil rights and social justice. It's all the same thing. You know, we talk about them being strange bedfellows, but they're the same thing. And I think that we would be remiss if we didn't say that, you know, we've heard about the 14th Amendment and, you know, this is civil rights again, but how do you get to the 14th Amendment? Who benefits? I cannot let the conversation continue without acknowledging that it was on the backs of enslaved.
That's right. That's right.
We come to this place. And the fact that they are still the least of these in this country, when you account for every factor outside of education, income, geographic region, all these things, that race still dogs us. So I want for us to engage in these civil rights conversations, but we have to have an honest conversation.
Yes.
We have to have an honest conversation in this regard, that none of this stuff will be possible without folks laying their lives on the line, and folks like Fannie Lou Hamer and Shirley Chisholm and Dolores Huerta and Cesar Chavez and many people who have laid their lives on the line, some of whom have given the ultimate sacrifice in the pursuit
Absolutely.
of civil rights and equity, that
Yeah.
we have to continue to make sure that we incorporate history and the nuance to ground the conversation. And
another part, I believe another part of America is putting a hierarchy on on those that have been disadvantaged through America. You know, Black people are the lowest of the totem pole. Asians are the highest of the disadvantaged. And there's this hierarchy, but we've all been treated the same by white America. And so it just honestly blows my mind that all of the minorities cannot come together in agreement, fight for one another to be included in the American way. Thank you all so much for being a part of this show. I really appreciate it. That is The Business of Being Black with Tammi Mack on Foxsoul. Cocktails with the Queens up next.